Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I am Ibrahim Aoude. Middle East Encounters. We'll be discussing this with three students from political science at the University of Hawai'i, Adrianna Overdorff, Michael Bernardini, and Stephen Cat. Adrianna and Stephen are also in my Middle East class, ES 455B, Ethnic Conflict in the Middle East, Comparative Ethnic Conflict, and so on. And Michael, you are also in a class on the Middle East.
That's correct.
Yeah.
I'm in both of Elton Daniels' classes, Introduction to Islam and Crisis and Conflict in the Middle East.
Yeah, good. So, Stephen, how did you get interested in Middle Eastern affairs?
I traveled a lot when I was younger, and I have been to the Middle East, Israel and Palestine, Egypt and such. But it wasn't until later in college that I started to care more about what was going on there because of the war.
Yeah.
I didn't agree with it, and I wanted to know more about the reasons people were upset and what the U.S. had done.
Yeah, and Adrianna, how did you become interested in Middle East affairs?
When I was about 9 or 10, I started getting pen pals from all over the world, and one of my closest pen pals was from Saudi Arabia, a young girl that was about the same age, and I just became fascinated, and I found the written Arabic to be really beautiful, and since then I just took a really great interest, and of course since the war started in Iraq also.
So since 2003, you mean
Since
you
2003.
had more interest in the Middle East. So have you taken courses on the Middle East before this course?
I never have. All my research has been just independent.
Okay. Yeah, that's very good. And Michael, you have taken other courses as well on Middle East before this? Or?
Wouldn't exactly say the Middle East centrally, but I've taken courses that have incorporated in the Middle East. But I mean, my interest has really been sparked by meeting and speaking to people. I mean, living in the city, you come in contact with a lot of different peoples, and through that encounter, I've been mistaken. My identity has been mistaken. People have, thought I was from different areas, and that just gets me interested right away because I want to learn about, well, maybe somewhere down the road, you never know. So definitely, that's what I'm very interested in.
Yeah, that's good. What I'm going to do now is I interviewed Morgan Cooper, who has an interest in the Middle East, especially Palestine, and she visited Palestine. And she's a student in English, a graduate student in English. So she talks about, some of her encounters in Palestine. We'll do that, and then we come back to the set and we discuss.
One time I took the other two children, our two girls. At the time, they were 6 and 8 years old. And they wanted to go swimming. It was in the summer, it was hot. So I found out where the public swimming pools were. Of course, there were none in the West Bank. So the one public swimming pool that we were going to go to was supposedly right over the checkpoint Kalandia, which is the checkpoint we used to go into Jerusalem. And being children under the age of 12, they can cross without a permit. It took us 4 hours to get to that swimming pool.
What's the distance?
By car, it should have been about 7-8 minutes. I don't know, a few kilometers probably we crossed. And I don't know for sure, but I don't think from this experience that the youngest 6-year-old girl had ever crossed a checkpoint before, except in her mother's car when she was going to the village to visit her relatives. But this was her first time crossing Kalandia. And, she sees 5 Israeli soldiers in front of her who are ushering. I mean, we're like animals herded into these lines. And it was so packed, and it's scary, the thought of losing a child that you're responsible for. So I'm trying to keep these kids really close and make sure nobody's breaking into my backpack. And you know, she was just shaking the whole time, this 6-year-old. And we finally got up there, and we were waiting, and there were maybe 10 feet before we got to the soldier who was going to check my passport. And the little girl looked up at me, and she said, "Morgan, it's the Yahud." Like, she didn't realize that the soldiers would be manning these checkpoints and that that's what she was waiting to get to. And she looked at me with such fear, like she was about to come face to face with an Israeli soldier. And she started crying. I mean, this little girl was so afraid of that experience. And I just kept telling her, "It's okay, we're just going to the swimming pool. Nothing's gonna happen, we're okay, it's okay." Every person I know in Palestine has a story of a friend or family member who has been abducted in the middle of the night and imprisoned, tortured, killed. These are the stories that even these children know about. And so seeing this soldier just trying to go to a swimming pool scared her to death.
Yeah, so here's Morgan, who's been to Palestine and Israel several times in the past 3-4 years. And she lived there with a family, Palestinian family, and so on. And she's describing, as you've seen, some of her experiences. So, Michael, you have an interest in issues, Palestinian issues, and so on. Did you want to comment on what Morgan was saying?
Yeah, I could. I mean, from my own personal opinion, I can't. I'm very sympathetic. It makes me, you know, sad, angry, because even though it was for brief spurts of time, I myself have experienced, you know, similar situations where just coming in contact with authority, such as military or the police, and to feel that your life is in danger. And these are supposed to be non-combatant situations, and yet you feel as if your life is threatened. And to go through that on an everyday basis, you know, in a place where that should never occur on an everyday basis, it just makes me sad. It makes me go through so many different emotions, and I can't imagine that somebody watching or hearing testimonial along those lines doesn't have the same, you know, feelings about it.
Yeah, I mean, Adrianna, we're talking about occupation, right? And you have also an interest in Iraq situation. Is there comparisons that jump at you in terms of Palestine, Iraq, and you could elaborate on those?
I think definitely when we consider what's going on in Iraq with the occupation, you can draw parallels and immediately see how being occupied by a foreign military and generally by young men of another culture who don't speak your language, who don't know your history, it would be absolutely terrifying. And when I think about children going through these things, it's just frightening that they're not responsible for what's going on, and they bear the brunt of political issues and things that have absolutely nothing to do with them.
Yeah. Also, like I know you your interest in Iraq makes you want to say a number of things on your mind regarding Iraq and how, for instance, Americans would form opinions on Iraq without really studying the situation or just from the propaganda given to them on CNN, Fox News, and so on. Would you want to elaborate on that?
I do think that because most Americans get their information from the mainstream media, that they walk away with those perspectives without really reading history or taking the opportunity to learn something. And so it's frustrating to be part of a society where information is disregarded and where justifications for war and support for war really stem from media and from propaganda rather than from real information, knowledge, compassion.
Yeah.
Steve, anything more on that?
On comparisons between the two, just how close the U.S. and Israel are now related, especially since 2001. They're combining their efforts in occupation under the war on terror. And you can see it in their response to the resistance. You know, under military occupation, there can be armed struggle against that. And in Hebron, no, was in Jenin, when you had over 10 Israeli soldiers killed. They destroyed the whole center of the town. They knocked down all the houses, they did everything. The same thing happened with the U.S. response in Fallujah. You have mercenaries that they call civilian contractors getting killed and their bodies being shown on the television. They respond by destroying the entire city. 70%, as Dar Jamal described, of the city, which included the killing of doctors during operations.
Yeah, and in fact on that, Dar Jamal, whose journalist covered Iraq and Lebanon, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in the summer and so on, he mentioned, in fact, in terms of Fallujah, that the attack on the civilian contractors, the 4 civilian contractors, was a response to the attack of Israel on Gaza. I mean, and he said that the resistance fighters in Iraq were saying exactly that, you know. So that is, you know, another parallel, that you cannot like pigeonhole things, like, you know, you cannot pigeonhole this is Iraq and this is Palestine and this is Lebanon, etc. They are all interconnected, it seems to me. So also, like, there is this opposition to the war building up, you know, to the war at least in Iraq, if not also Afghanistan, and maybe extension of the war to Iran perhaps, or other places. And so one of the things, Adrianna, you're interested in is why people are opposed to the war. And so would you like to say more about that?
Sure. I think just of recent, and really very recently, because of the shift in power in the House and the Democratic victory, people are now talking about the U.S. exiting Iraq. And I think a lot of the discourse is surrounding, you know, going against the war in Iraq is because it's too costly to the Americans, and also the loss of American lives, which is interesting, because one of the primary reasons we decided to go to Iraq was because we wanted to save the women and children and send them to school and give them a new life. And so now that we're talking about leaving, and it doesn't have anything to do at all with the people, is revealing.
Yeah. But actually also, you know, in fairness, there's a lot of people who are opposed to the war for what we might call humanitarian reasons. In fact, you mentioned that before, humanitarian reasons. But majority is perhaps, or a significant minority is because of those other concerns. So we don't know. But how do you think then we can, like, make the opposition to the war in a way for humanitarian reasons and for the, shall we say, right reasons, as opposed to the wrong reason why we shouldn't be, say, in Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere else? Would you want to comment on that?
I can. I don't want to sound like you know, I'm bashing my own culture or anything, but I think it is a cultural issue. I think we have to be concerned about those things in our own backyard before we even concerned about them in Iraq. I mean, look at what the environmental degradation has gone on right here in Hawaii by our own, you know, Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, name them. I mean, the pollution is just out of control, from depleted uranium to just clogging streams. It's there, and that's what's going on in Iraq, from the very top to the lowest level. And to say that people are gonna, you know, want to leave, want to exit Iraq for the right reasons, I think it's going to take, you know, cultural changes to occur. People realizing that, wait, these things are wrong here, then they're definitely wrong somewhere else where we're not personally affected, yet we're causing the situation. And I think that's what needs to happen.
Right. Any comments, Steve?
Well, there's just an attitude that's been perpetuated that America is the best in so many different categories, and that we need to go help other people get as good as we are. And then that's what the guise of military intervention is. And then when things don't go exactly how we planned, we're not greeted as liberators, then the attitude turns to, oh, well, they can't be helped. We tried, but they can't. So the victim is blamed. The people who we thought we were going to liberate are blamed for screwing up their country, when in fact it's screwed up because of military occupation and a lot of death.
Right. Yes.
If I could just add to that, I mean, that's exactly what it's, the occupation factor, and like what's going on in Hawaii and has been going on in Hawaii since, 1898 with the annexation process, or false annexation process. That's exactly what we have, is military occupation, and that's what you see in occupied regions all over the world, from Israel to Iraq to Hawaii, Puerto Rico. I mean, these are dumping grounds, for the empires. And
that's a good perspective. Also, like in terms of, again, like in Iraq, well, it's those terrorists who are making life miserable, or before that it was Saddam Hussein who made life miserable for the Iraqi people, and like death of civilians during the sanctions, etc., were blamed on Saddam Hussein, who is who was a terrible leader. But I mean, the fact of the matter, it was the sanctions that created all these problems. It is the occupation that has been creating all these problems and brought Iraq to the level it is at now. The same thing in terms of Israel and Palestine. The Israelis say, well, we want to stop the terrorists from hitting rockets on, Israeli villages, etc. Well, if you were not there, or the occupation was not there, these things wouldn't have happened. If, for instance, settlers or colonialists, Israeli colonialists, take land in the West Bank and before that in Gaza, etc., and illegally, I mean, these guys are terrorists, go and terrorizing Palestinian civilians to take their land, etc., sanctioned by the army. If all that doesn't happen, then things would have been much, much different, I would say. So one of the problems then, in terms of people supporting the war, for instance, or not knowing much about what's going on, etc., is because people are not getting educated about this. So it is good to have those encounters that we all have had with the Middle East. Any more comments on this?
Well, just another similarity between the actions of the U.S. and Israel is their disdain, their contempt they feel for the international community, the United Nations, and the media. And you see that in the treatment of those people. They disregard resolutions passed by the UN media, like UN Resolution 242, and journalists are killed. 15 journalists have been killed by the U.S. in this war, 189 so far, mostly of them Iraqi. They harness their information and make sure that it's filtered to make the U.S. look like their actions are in a good light.
So what I'm going to do is I interviewed Ibrahim Bilski, also a student in political science, and see how he became interested and what his encounters were with the Middle East.
Growing up with the Manhattan skyline and having family all over New York, and many who sat on rooftops and watched the buildings collapse and share their experience and all, it definitely hit home. One aunt was running from the falling debris as the building fell, because she had a meeting in one of the towers, and so that was pretty intense, and my family reached out to my grandfather, who's well-read and followed politics all his life and whatnot, and and he explains, you got to learn your history. America has some blood on its hands, and at the same time that we were talking to him, we were getting messages from this administration and the high ups there, telling us, this other from elsewhere attacked us because they hate our freedom and they hate democracy. And I had a hard time with that. I understand at this point that desperate times are what call for desperate measures, So you got to be pretty desperate if you're going to go out of your way to kill or even sacrifice your own life. And I later made that connect with these kids throwing rocks at tanks and soldiers. You got to be pretty desperate if you're just chucking pieces of cement at soldiers who have rifles and whatnot. So I had a hard time with that. And then the other message was to go to the malls and continue shopping. And I remember specifically Bush saying, take the family to Disney World. And I was pretty outraged by this. So it was like, oh, I need to start learning more about the world around me, especially as people started debating issues. That was when I really felt like, wow, I don't know my history and I've got to do something about this.
So that's how you fight terrorism. You go shopping. It's interesting. I mean, there's some logic to it, but I mean, you know, they went beyond that straightforward logic. So any comments on Brian, anyone?
I guess I could comment on it. I just find it real interesting that it was his grandfather, you know, who most likely was of World War II generation, who was the one who the family turned to. And you don't really see that in America anymore, you know, in U.S. culture. You really don't see the holding up of what an elder has to say about a situation. And now that I reflect, I remember at a lot of protests that I was at and that I took part in, it was, I mean, we were being led by, you know, older women. And a lot of older women were protesting against what was going on because, you know, they've been through so much already and they've heard the propaganda. They've heard all the propaganda. And to hear it again in such a different light, it seems like those should have been the people that we were turning to for answers instead of turning to the good-looking blonde on Fox News, you know, who's just being fed stuff. And I think it speaks volumes.
Yeah. Also, like you know, Brian mentioned 911 basically, and one can say how has 911 affected the United States, and we can, like, you know, unpack this kind of thing. But also because of that, you see that the administration made the connection, at least temporarily, between Iraq and 911, although it was a false connection, but that's how they did it, through propaganda. And it led the US people to support the war in their overwhelming majority. But now, after like 4 years or so of it, we have less of support for the war, like maybe 70% of the people don't support it, and so on. So this leads me to the question of how did the 911 and the occupation of Iraq, how did it affect U.S. society? Adrianna, would you want to?
I think that it definitely varies, but I think for a large portion of the American people, it's been very demoralizing, and that the victims of 9/11 have been used to fuel yet 2 other wars, and more violence is an extremely revealing tragedy for the American people, whether we like to realize it or not, and that the conversations about 9/11 and its relationship to Iraq and everything are now being raised, and questions, and everybody wants answers, is frustrating because it's late. It's too late for the people in Afghanistan. It's too late for the people in Iraq. And although it's important that the issues are raised and that the truth is revealed, I do think that it's a little bit late.
Yeah, and this brings me to another thing, which is like there is this, I suppose, notion that, and we were talking about it once before, about, you know, there's no need or it's useless to study history because it's something in the past. We have to be like forward-looking and looking at what's going to happen later on. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why the American public has been fooled because they don't know their history or they have bad history. In fact, Howard Zinn gave a lecture at Wisconsin not long ago, and he was talking about the need to read history and study history, etc., and good history, not like, you know, Napoleon conquered Russia or something like that, you know, but I mean the real history of the people. After all, Howard Zinn has written this book, you know, history, what is it, the People's History of the United States. And so it was interesting. He made the point that how history is very important, not for the past, for the present and the future. So comments on this?
It's not good for the American imperial agenda to have your citizens learning about the bad things you've done in the past because you're still doing them, and you want them to facilitate the ones you want to do in the future. So you have to take out history and geography so that people don't know the places that the troops are going to, and they don't know the reasons. They don't know that they've been there before. You just have to keep them comfort, like Bush said. He said, we're the government. We'll take this problem on. You guys go shopping. Trust us. We'll do everything.
Yeah.
And now people are starting to ask questions. But it's too late. We need to demand the reasons why. Once we were attacked, we need to ask, why are these people so angry?
Well, it's simple, because they, you know, don't like our
They can't go to Disneyland.
freedom and democracy. You know? They don't like civilization. They like barbarism and all that kind of stuff. So yes, on that.
If I could just go off of that, I think it's very interesting. I mean, because what we're playing is a name game, and who's defining these terms that we're using. And I think that's very important, because when you're talking about democracy, we're not talking about the American version of democracy. We say democracy. We don't say American democracy or American Republican democracy, because we're not a free democracy in the sense that we get to vote for the laws that are imposed upon us. I didn't vote for the, you know, Freedom of Information Act, or, you know, illegalizing marijuana, or the drinking age, or anything of the sort. And so I think that's what needs to be recognized, is we're defining who's the terrorist, who's tyrannical, you know, who's democratic.
Yeah. Anything, Annie, on that?
I think it's that we've gone to war with Iraq, and that there was a war in Afghanistan, and the potential for a war in Iran is really a consequence of how short our attention spans are, and how very disinterested we are in politics, in history, and the list goes on and on.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about, like, in terms of propaganda, and we've studied this in the course about representation of the other, right, by the colonial power or the imperial power, etc. So how, for instance, Middle Eastern peoples are being represented, and who represents them as well, is very telling in terms of when you look at CNN and Fox and so on. So do you want to say more about that, or?
They're clearly not qualified. Members of the mainstream media are clearly not qualified to represent anyone other than U.S. government interests or corporate interests, or Rupert Murdoch or whomever else is paying their salaries.
Yeah, Steve. Did you want to? Sorry, did you want to say more? Yeah, Steve.
Just as far as the attitude and the representation, I mean, I've seen targets that the military practice is shooting at, and they are beards, hatas, they are Muslims. That's what their practice is shooting at. It's not silhouettes of a person, no. They're talking about focusing the hatred, focusing the energy on that. Why? Because they have their imperial reasons, their resource things. But to do that, they first have to degrade the other person. And that's where history comes in again. You don't want to know that person's history. They are, you know, troublemakers. They need to be dealt with. Nothing about their struggle.
Yeah, so that's, I think these are very interesting things, because, you know, if you target practice on an Arab-looking person, then it means, like, you gotta hate him to kill him, you know, so they're developing that hatred in you. Which leads me to ask something about people who go to fight there, what is in their head? We're not gonna know. I mean, this is like a rhetorical question. What's in their head? But I think some kind of answer to say it is perhaps what's in their head to let them go there and kill somebody is because of how they have been socialized and that particular propaganda. So anyone on that?
If I could speak of just, I mean, we have to, again, identify what these things are, and it's straight brainwashing. And I think there's no way of getting around it with any other term other than what it is and what we've been doing to our own society. Not to say that other societies don't do it through the same media outlets, but I'm not sure if it's on the same level that we use it. And I was just actually watching a documentary called Winter Soldier, where a lot of the soldiers, that's what they're talking about. They're speaking of the brainwashing that was going on. You feel like you're going into this thing because of what the government has put before you, that we're spreading freedom, that these people want us there. And so you go into the boot camps, and then they completely shred every bit of almost humanity that you have within you and turn you into a soldier, you know, a machine.
That's right, because it seems to me then the American GI becomes a representative of the Iraqi people in a sense, because he wants to liberate them and, you know, deliver them for you know, a good society or something of that nature. But in fact, he is actually killing them as he is trying to deliver them and represent them. So that kind of thing looks to me as contradictory, the representation and the mission and the killing of the Iraqi, despite the mission of saving the Iraqi. You know, so I think these are very interesting ones. But the other thing related to this, those people who go there, they probably, most of them believe that they're there for freedom and democracy and the rest of it. But actually, and I was watching Howard Zinn speech a few days back, and he was talking about, well, actually these guys are fighting for Bush and fighting for the corporations and not fighting for their values, the values that they think they're going there to fight for, etc. Any more on that?
Just that they have to force on them that they are going there to accomplish this great thing, and that anyone gets in their way is against the great thing that they're trying to accomplish, which is this freedom and democracy. So that way they're able to group the Iraqis into good Iraqis, bad Iraqis, forgetting that they're Iraqis, that they're in Iraq, and that the person with the gun is from the U.S. They have no right to come there and make their place better. But because they've been instilled with that mission, that goal in their mind, those that oppose, they clamp down on.
I also think that it would be unfair for us to make generalizations about every person, person fighting the war in Iraq, and I would say that a lot of them do not support what they're doing, and they're simply following orders, and there's obviously issues with that, but I think that a lot of them are against what's going on and did not join the military to fight a war in Iraq or in Afghanistan, but joined the military as a means to go to college, as a path to a career. And so I think
that's
it's
really true. That's a good point. Yeah, because in fact a lot of the generals don't agree with the war in Iraq, but now that since they are there, they didn't want to go in the first place. A lot of them, but now since they are there, they want to do the job, whatever that job is. Yeah. So that's a good point. But that leads me also to talk about weapons of mass destruction that the American armed forces have used in Iraq. So, Steve, did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, well, the U.S. is always talking about threats to themselves, threats to the world, when in reality they are the largest threat. They're the ones who have proven to use weapons of mass destruction. We dropped nukes. And we're the people who are planning for war while accusing someone else of being a threat. The weapons we use, the U.S. uses, are very deadly, not only in the firepower they provide, but in the fact that some of them are radioactive. Depleted uranium ammunition causes all kinds of health effects on not only the people it's fired at, but the people who handled it. So the U.S. troops themselves are affected. Many of them are affected. In the U.S.-Israeli invasion of Lebanon over the summer, the 34th-day invasion, Robert Fisk talks about 2 babies who were taken from a mortuary drawer to be transported and burst back into flames outside because a new weapon was found, which is using white phosphorus and enriched uranium. That's a nuclear weapon being deployed.
Yeah.
Israeli weapons come from the U.S.
Yeah, well, that's true. So we've seen that happen in the siege of Fallujah also, and Dar Jamal also talked about that. So it's interesting, you know, who's using the weapons of mass destruction and who's complaining about them are the same people, you know. Complain not about their WMDs, but the other guys' WMDs, even if they don't have it, they complain about that. I want to go back to Morgan Cooper, and she talks about her experience with the wall that is being built in Palestine. It's probably almost there, complete, you know, but it might take another year or something, but it's basically there. And I am reflecting about the wall and the Mexican-U.S. border as well. So these are like kind of comparisons, etc. So we go to Morgan, and then we talk more about that.
The 5th time I entered Palestine, you have to go through Jerusalem, cross the Calandia checkpoint to get to Ramallah. The wall was right there. The wall had been constructed in that part of East Jerusalem right up to Ramallah, and it was the most imposing, threatening, horrible wall of a wall that I'd ever seen or could have imagined. It's these gigantic concrete slabs. It's absolutely impenetrable. So as far as security, Israelis did a great job constructing this. Unfortunately, if there were any desire for me to cross into Jerusalem at that point or into Ramallah, like, it was null. Because with the construction of that wall has come the construction of permanent checkpoints, which are far worse than the haphazard kind of roadblocks that we used to cross through. There's a system, with this wall came a system of gates that you get buzzed in and you become locked in. So after you're waiting in this crowd of 100, all of a sudden the lights turn green above these big gates and you can one at a time go through. Everyone's trying to get through, so it's almost impossible to get one person through. It keeps getting jammed. When you get through that, you're stuck in a cage, and how long you're in that cage depends. I've gone through at times where I'm in the cage just to pass through, and I've gone through at other times when I'm with a lot of Palestinians where we're held in this cage for up to an hour before we can pass through to another point where we get in another line to go through individually and be checked. Older people, disabled people, children, it's nearly impossible. I've seen parents separated from little kids who are just screaming on one side and it's red. They can't get them through to get to be with their parents. I mean, it's just horrifying and traumatizing for these little children. And it makes travel, which was already difficult, nearly impossible.
Yeah, so, the propaganda is that the wall is to separate the terrorists from Israel and not allow them to attack and so on. But they don't talk about what it does to the Palestinian people and how they divide villages and towns and families from each other and so on. And Palestinians from their livelihood if they are tilling the land, so the land is on one side of the wall and their house on the other, so they have to have a permit to go and till the land, and they have to go take like a detour which might be like for 2-3 hours before they get to the land. So it's really horrendous, and something like that would encourage ethnic cleansing and so on. And that's basically what the wall is all about. Any discussion on this, Adrianna?
I think I'm really amazed that we've come so far in human history and that we think that dividing people using physical structures is actually going to work or a good idea or functional in any way. I guess the study of history, the study of peoples, the study of conflict, of ethnic conflict, means very little to the Israeli government.
Yeah. Steve, anything on the wall? For
It's
instance?
just interesting that the Berlin Wall was a beacon of tyranny that the U.S. talked about how bad the Soviet Union was for what to do. And this wall is so much bigger, so much longer, and affects so many more people. And as you said, tilling the land, basic sustenance is being taken away from them. Olive trees, as a sign of culture, are being destroyed. And it's very, very wrong. And that people don't know about this, or that people can somehow justify their opinion of support for it, is crazy without getting all the facts, without listening to the little people, the little kids who have to go through that. Yeah. Or the pregnant women who have to give birth at the checkpoint.
That's right, and a number of incidents.
All
like
the
that.
power is in that one soldier, in that gun.
Yeah. I want to go to Brian interview, Brian Bilski's interview. This segment, he talks about an interesting thing regarding Palestine and also propaganda. So we'll see that and then discuss.
Found effect on me. It really showed how different media outlets were covering some of the same situations differently. whereas American media outlets were saying Palestinians attacked and Israel is always responding. You saw that other media outlets were saying, hey, you know, the Palestinians were actually responding from something earlier. It showed a side of the story that I was not really seeing, and I think it's important, you know, coupled with so much of the debate with Israel is folks mention Israel like it's this united place of people, this united nation that agrees with its policies. And then to look a little deeper to see that it's actually quite divided itself with, you know, 5 major parties within it. And it's the powerful elite who are going to be the ones pushing the serious oppression militarily and the horrible conditions for Palestine, and that there's actually voices within Israel who says this is unacceptable, this has to stop. But we never see those voices on American media. Well, in the film, there's some career military guys who speak out, you know, and they've been in the Israeli military for, you know, 2+ decades in some very violent areas, and they speak out and say, hey, we're experts on this. This is not going to bring peace. This is wrong. This needs to stop. We're not making matters better for anybody, you know, and those are voices that should be listened to, you know. They seem to offer some sort of insight.
Yeah, so like Brian was talking about this film called Peace, Propaganda, and the Promised Land, and he showed the distortions of, again, representation of the Palestinian and who is representing the Palestinian as they talk. It's these talking heads who come from the Pentagon and you know, some research institute in the United States that has a certain agenda, you know, to accomplish, etc., or pro-Israeli think tank and so on. So that's one thing that we can see. But any more discussion on this regarding what we have watched Brian talking about?
The Israeli government, after the war in Lebanon, which ended in 1982, and the massacres in Sabra and Shatila, Israel was upset because in the media they were looked at in a bad light. Mm-hmm. And what they decided to do about it was not change their policies, but change the light that they're looked at. Yeah. And this has come through billions of dollars of support and connections to U.S. media outlets, so that the U.S. media is portraying Israel as someone doing good things in that region, because so much support comes from the U.S. It's gotten so bad that the U.S. media is now more pro-Israeli than the Israeli media is.
Yeah, right.
And there's a lot of dissent there.
That's right. And that speaks to another point that Brian was talking about, but you also, we were talking about it before that, you know, are all Israelis, you know, pro their government's policy?
Yeah, actually I was doing research for a paper actually for Elton Daniels' class, and that I actually saw that film, and that gave me a lot of good insight as well to just how large the scope is of the colonization process, and that there's like low level, which is direct, I think, confrontation, which is on the Israeli and the Zionist part, and that comes with encompassing the Israeli government trying to encompass all Jews as if they are all followers of Israel and the Zionist commentary, which is not the truth. I mean, there's what they label as actually the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, actually labels the non-Zionists, actually anti-Zionists, as ultra-Orthodox Jews. Yeah, yeah, you know, right. Which is the same case in America, whereas there is a large, actually, rabbis against Israel, which is led by Yisrael Weiss, and who stage protests all over Palestine, all over the U.S., and around the world, as far as getting rabbis and other ultra-Orthodox Jews who are anti-Zionists together. You know.
There's this organization called Rabbis for Peace.
Rabbis for Peace as well.
Yeah, so that also leads me to talk about the relationship of democracy and in the U.S. and the region, democracy, U.S. and the region. So here is like the U.S. is in support of Israel because it is the only democracy. I mean, that's the line we are fed. It's the only democracy and so on. And in fact, if you look at it, at what's happening inside Israel, it's not really the only democracy because 20% of the population are third-class citizens. And these are the Palestinians, Palestinian Arabs who still live in Israel, who were not kicked, well, when everybody was kicked out, these guys stayed.
No.
You know? And so if there is like already discrimination in a big way, so how come this would be a democracy, for instance? So any quick comments on this? Yes?
Just that as a democracy, Israel is led by many, many former military generals and special forces commanders. Ehud Barak, for one, led an assassination to Beirut. And the three main resistance/terrorist organizations that helped Israel get its creation were led by people who later became prime ministers, Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, and Yitzhak Rabin. So you have known terrorists leading the country more than once.
Yes.
Some democracy.
Right, right. So what I want to do now is go to another segment, and this is Laura Lyons. She's a professor of English, and she is teaching a class about 911 and representations of 911 and so on. So we'll watch that and then comment on it.
Right now I'm teaching a class on September 11th called Representations of September 11th, Crisis, Memory, and Trauma. And much of the class has been focused on the immediate sort of fallout and attempts to represent those attacks immediately. How do we understand them? What do we understand their causes to be? And then as the class has gone on, we also are increasingly looking at the war in Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, the issues with the detainees in Guantanamo, extraordinary rendition, those kinds of things, because I think this is one of the troubles I've been thinking about as I read a lot of accounts of September 11th, whether they're literary or they're analytic, is that the more they're focused only on that day, the less they can actually tell us ultimately. And there's something, I think, a little bit, I don't know, claustrophobic about just focusing on that day, and not understanding it in terms of a broader geopolitical sensibility, things that were changing and happening. So we necessarily, I think, have to talk about the Iraq War.
Yeah, so I mean, this is like Laura Lyons, and her class is an important one. And also I want to say, like, also Faridi Farhi in political science, every other semester she teaches a class on the Middle East. You have taken that one.
I took it last semester.
Yeah, so you want to say something?
Yeah, well, she focused on the politics of the Middle East as they are now and how they became that way. So history.
Yeah, that's good, yeah.
And she tried to show that the diversification of the region and the diversification of the people, so that U.S. people are not lumping such a large region into one category. And that category is shifting all the time. The U.S. makes up their own things. And without learning about the people, without learning about the place, we don't know whether they're telling the truth or not.
That's right. What I'm going to do, because we still have a lot of time, but we're running out of it as well. I want to go to a segment by Morgan Cooper, and she talks about her project, and it ties in with what we are discussing.
The master's project that I'm working on will focus on this wall and the role that this wall is playing in the Israeli occupation, and particularly on individuals' experiences under this wall. Actually, all of my papers that I'm writing now are focused on Palestine, which allows me to do greater amounts of research. I am obviously still in contact with all of my friends and family adopted family now in Palestine, trying to get funding to go back there next summer, and so in terms of furthering my own education. And then for me, one of the most important things that I can do is talk to individuals and ask them, you know, how they feel about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And what I most value is trying to show people that these myths, that the conflict is intractable, that it is so historically rooted that we can't understand it, that it's so complex that we shouldn't try to understand it. I want people to understand that these are myths, these aren't true, and that I'm an example of someone who has gone from total ignorance to self-educating and realizing that this situation, okay, maybe we can't solve this conflict, but I don't think that we're looking for one solution here, but that we're looking for ways to better the situation.
Okay, so like more on the wall, and you know, the role of the individual in history, I mean, is very important. Even if you talk to some individuals, and maybe like someone would read that master's thesis, and they learn something from it, you know, and so on. Any comments, Adrianna?
I think that that's a really good academic project to take up. It's so important, so little is known about it, and obviously we all commend her for taking up that research and for going there and wanting to go back. I think it's really obviously because the United States government gives Israel their weapons and the bulk of their money, that it's important for everyone to really take a closer look.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to ask you something, because you're also interested in Darfur, the Darfur region in Sudan. Do you want to say something about that situation and how it relates to what we're talking about?
Sure. I think that both the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the conflict in Darfur are characterized by the American media as being, in Israel, for example, it's the terrorists against this poor government that's a weak actor. And in Darfur, it's characterized as an Arab-African conflict. And just a little bit of research will show that most of the ways that the people in Darfur are characterized, the perpetrators are Arab and the victims are, who knows? Mm. All we know is that the perpetrators are Arab and that the government is an Islamist regime, and we know very little else about the conflict. And it's later on in the years to come, we'll realize what a tragedy that is, that we know so little about it, and that the way that the conflict has been characterized has really made it possible for the U.S. to stay out, mm-hmm. and for the world to leave it alone, mm-hmm. to forget about the victims, to forget about people who probably wonder, where's the rest of the world?
Yes, absolutely. Just like the Palestinians wonder, where's the rest of the world? Mm-hmm. And if the rest of the world is coming, it's with Israel against them too, mm-hmm. you know, because of you know, pressure from the United States and arm twisting, etc. What I want to do is go to Laura Lyons. She's talking about you know, some of the stuff that she does, you know, in terms of her research, etc. And I think it is quite instructive. So we do that.
So I like to work with a text called Live from Palestine that brings together sort of testimonies by International Solidarity Movement workers, which is an official kind of NGO group. And then firsthand testimony of Palestinians living in the Palestinian Authority, or what we still might call the occupied territories, and having them read those accounts and, you know, think, why is it that this is not what you get to hear on the news? Why is that? Sort of trying to get them to see, I think, some of those things, and to, you know, humanize a population that, because it has had so few representatives in any kind of dominant media, to have them have a sense of what, you know, for lack of a better word, what their voice is, or what is it that they think. Not that they all think the same necessarily, but that, you know, these are people who have ideas about their situation, who ought to be consulted about things, who, you know, ought not to be treated in such demonized ways, and, you know, demonized and dehumanized, I think, really.
Yeah, so I mean, it's good. Like again, it's representation and so on. And why shouldn't the victim speak for themselves, you know, and so on? And that is like in terms of your education, how valuable do you find this thing is that Laura is talking about, Adrianna?
Well, I know that I personally don't like to be represented pretty much by anyone. Do you? I mean, do you trust? Who do you trust to represent you? And I think it really does come down to that, that the voice of reason and that being represented is such a critical thing, and that it's only fair to give a voice to victims in any conflict, especially in Israel, especially in Iraq, especially in Darfur, in order to better understand what's going on and what needs to be done and what can be done.
I wanted also to talk, you know, a little bit, because we are running out of time now, more so than before. Is that, you know, on about Lebanon, and again, like the notion of democracy and all that, and how the U.S. has not really pressured Israel during the attack on Lebanon to, you know, go for a ceasefire, yeah? So, and then what we find that the U.S. saying, well, Israel has the right to defend itself. So any comments on this, anyone?
Yeah. I think it's, once again, it's the colonials, defining the terms in which the conflict is taking place. And these are empires who are protecting, you know, what they have gained, essentially illegally in most occasions. And I think that, that goes to direct conflict. I mean, they skew information. I mean, I was on Israel's official government website, and there was no mention of the bombing of power plants in Lebanon that led to almost 30,000 tons of crude oil into the Mediterranean Ocean. And there's no mention of that. And I didn't hear any mention of it in American news either. And I think that goes right to the heart of the issue, is that they see themselves as colonials. And this is a colonization process. You know, and for them, this is just another step in that movement, I feel.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that the U.S. said that no ceasefire was able to come, when the U.S. is the only country in the world who could enforce a ceasefire by limiting the amount of weapons going to Israel.
Yeah.
The U.S. could have stopped it at any time they wanted to, but instead they increased their emissions. It's the colonial attitude.
Yeah. So we have, like, in terms of the Middle East region, the danger for an expansion of the war, and not like expansion to Iran, but through expansion to Iran, I mean, the whole conflagration of the entire region. So that's one thing. The other thing, the environmental disaster that's happened in Iraq, in Lebanon still, you know,
Israel.
and in Israel, etc., Palestine, and then the notions of democracy, you know, that the U.S. keeps promoting, etc., not letting the people know why it is there in the first place, in terms of like empire and trying to encircle China and so on, to remain dominant in the world. So anyway, so any quick comments on this before? They're telling us time is almost out, so no quick comments. Thank you for coming and discussing this, and thanks to our viewers, and see you next year. Happy New Year. So we